And that will be followed by a question time in which you are encouraged to ask questions by way of the chat function. Obviously, everyone will see your questions. We really encourage that, because what will happen after the 20-minute presentation, there will be each part of our team will answer the questions appropriate to whatever chapter's been or questions been referred to. So if you would really encourage you to ask questions throughout that presentation, we can be ready to start at the end with some questions, and we can start to ask the particular analysts whichever is the appropriate question. So keep that in mind. The whole presentation is expected to last no more than 1 hour, with the questions included. In the chat, just another thing to note, we have supplied a link to the report if you don't already have it, which has associated videos and for the first time, an interactive dashboard with all the charts and figures that you can access there. So that's just something there. And also we've got a form there on the chat to fill out if you'd like to be on our database. We're keen to keep in communication, send information. If you're interested in that, you could fill that form out. Otherwise, all that said, time now to start the presentation. And then, like I said, just a reminder, really encourage you to ask questions maybe throughout this, and we'll try to answer them the best we can.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome to the launch of the Salvation Army's State of the Nation report for 2022. We hope this presentation will be informative and challenging, but also a means of hope. This is the 15th State of the Nation report that we have produced. While this report will mostly focus on 2021 and the social impact of COVID, we have been tracking some of these indicators for some time, and the social progress of Aotearoa New Zealand needs to be measured over the longer term. Some of our analysis will be provided with an awareness of the longer term journey. The theme for this report this year is Whakatere Ana Ina Tere, Navigating the Rapids. The theme encapsulates the uncertain and anxious times of COVID-19 that we continue to navigate our way through. COVID has had a big impact on many people, and we haven't managed to navigate our way through the rapids just yet. The journey must continue. Neither can all our challenges be attributed to COVID. Many of these challenges existed well before. The report covers 5 areas: our children, work and incomes, housing, crime and punishment, and social hazards. These hazards include alcohol, drugs, gambling and debt. The authors who contributed to the report are Barber, Ronji Tanielu and Ana Ika. They will each give a brief 3-minute summary of the sections of the report they are responsible for, and then Auxiliary Captain Amiria Whiu will give a brief summary of the Maori Wellbeing section. As we present this report, I leave these words from the Bible with you. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in hope. God bless you.
Kia ora koutou. All children and young people should be safe and live free from poverty and have the chance to live fulfilled lives. That's the vision that should inspire us all. In the State of the Nation 2022, we look at how things have been going for our youth over the past year, and indeed over the 15 years that we have been reporting. The official child poverty figures for June 2021 were not available before we released our report, but child poverty was decreasing in the 2 years before March 2020 when COVID hit. But the children who live in households that rely on welfare benefits are the ones most likely to be living in poverty. And at the end of 2021, There were nearly 209,000 children in that situation, some 21,000 more than 2 years ago before the COVID pandemic began. And we have to ask, are the increases in welfare benefits over the past couple of years enough to keep lifting these children out of poverty? Keeping children safe from abuse and violence is also essential to them doing well in life. But the number of children recorded as victims of abuse rose last year by over 600 to nearly 13,500 children. That's 1.2% of all children, and it's about the same level as 5 years ago. And there were also increases in the number of children identified as victims of violence, assaults, and sexual assault. How well young people do in education has a big impact on their future, and it starts early, with early childhood education. There were fewer children enrolled in ECE in 2020 as a result of the COVID pandemic. The number increased again in 2021, but it was still lower than before the pandemic began. At the other end of the school journey, the most recent data from 2020 school year shows that the overall proportion of students leaving school with at least NCEA Level 1 remains similar to 2019, but the proportion of Maori school leavers achieving this actually reduced. The pressures on young people's mental health seem to be increasing, and more of them are reporting moderate to high levels of psychological distress, such as anxiety or depression. What we have grounds for hope are a couple of long-term trends over more than a decade in declining youth offending rates and the reducing pregnancies in under 20-year-olds. Those positive trends are a result of considerable change in how our society responds to youth offending and to sexuality. Kia ora koutou. At the start of 2022, we're coming from a year full of the continuing disruption caused by the COVID pandemic and the uncertainty it creates. 4 months of COVID alert level restrictions and lockdowns in Auckland and surrounding regions, migration down to a fraction of pre-COVID levels, and then a September quarter that saw the economy shrink significantly, but we also saw record low unemployment. These are just some of the features of another year of disturbance for our nation to navigate. Yet when we look at the effects of this on our incomes and employment, we can see the overall benefit from looking after the health of our people as a priority. It gives space for our communities and for our economy to adjust and to keep functioning. The wage subsidy and other employment support measures meant that employers seem to be keeping people in employment, and that the increase in the minimum wage also helped lift the lowest income wages again. Another year of mostly closed borders has meant disruption for many, and it means our nation is in a real-life social experiment of what happens when access to overseas labour is largely turned off. One result is record low unemployment. People who have been out of the workforce have been drawn back in. The total number of people who are jobless fell by 75,000 over the past year. This has helped women's employment especially, and the unemployment rate for Pacific people has fallen below the pre-COVID level. But not everyone has benefited equally, with young people and Maori unemployment rates not falling as much. And the number of people on the job seeker welfare benefit is still well above what it was before COVID. The government has increased welfare benefits again in last July, helping those on the lowest incomes. But the return of higher inflation in late 2021 is putting further pressure on people and highlights the need to keep the focus on lifting incomes to adequate levels. Increased government hardship assistance grants signal the pressures on people, and the Salvation Army, where we distributed over 77,000 food parcels during 2021. That's less than in 2020, but still nearly 30% higher than before COVID arrived. A lot of work has gone into a whole range of responses to food insecurity in communities, such as lunches in schools, food recovery and local food networks, and it may be beginning to have an effect. The New Zealand Health Survey results show that in 2021, fewer families reported this year that they ran out of food, often or sometimes, compared to previous years.
The housing section in this year's report has some good news, but lots of challenging and hard news as well, especially for renters, potential first home buyers, and those facing major housing challenges. It's encouraging to see in the numbers the continuing increase in the number of consents for new dwellings, as you can sort of see behind me. This shows that housing supply is increasing overall. But as a Christian church and organization, the Salvation Army has consistently fought for increasing the supply of warm, safe, affordable social housing for the poorest and most vulnerable in our communities. With the statistical number of houses increasing, what we really need to ask is whether we are building enough social or public housing in the right locations for poorer New Zealanders across the country. Unfortunately, there's a lot more bad news in this report than good news when it comes to housing. The Social Housing Register, which is commonly known as the waiting list, has now peaked at over 25,000 applicants. That's enough to fill Spark Arena in Auckland twice over. But the actual number of people waiting for a social house, it's much bigger than the 25,000 when you add the families and children of these applicants. The demand for social housing continues to worsen across the different regions that we've tracked across the country. The number of people in emergency housing, which is usually a motel or a campsite, now sits at over 10,000 people, including over 4,500 children. That means that nearly half of those in emergency housing are children. This is not a good, safe environment for those children and whānau. For renters, the story is really tough. Rents in traditionally lower income suburbs across the country have shown shocking increases in the last 5 to 10 years. Renting a 3-bedroom house in Fordlands and Rotorua has increased by 146% in the last decade. In Cannons Creek in Porirua, renting a 3-bedroom house has increased by 100% in the last 10 years. In 2011, you could rent a 3-bedroom house in Porirua for $270 per week. By 2021, if you rented a 3-bedroom house, it would cost you $540 per week. These are crazy increases in the rental market. And crazy increases are all over the housing market too. Affordability issues are constantly in the media today. National average house sale prices have increased by 27% in the last year and increased by 50% in the last 5 years. All the regions that we tracked in the last report have had major increases in house prices in the last year. Tauranga prices up by 33%, Palmerston North prices up by 34%, Christchurch up by 36%, and Auckland house prices up by 21% in the last year alone. Media and governments often talk about the housing crisis in Aotearoa. And to be honest, there are a lot of New Zealanders actually doing quite well in the housing market today. But for those who are renting and those trying to purchase their first home, things are going to be extremely tough for them for a long time. But for those with severe housing need, those facing homelessness, those facing real housing stress, those living in emergency housing or transitional housing in unsafe environments, those waiting to get a place in a warm, safe, affordable house, what we believe at the Salvation Army is that we need to elevate this housing crisis actually to a housing catastrophe to truly describe the reality of those in the sharper end of housing in Aotearoa.
Even though the data reported in the justice sector is only a fraction of the reality, it is still valuable as a proxy to show the extent of crime our communities are facing and how we as a society address offending. This is what we try and illustrate in the Crime and Punishment chapter. The number of offenders and proceedings against them by the police have been declining. However, the number of victims and the times they have been victimised have been increasing. According to the New Zealand Crime Victim Survey in 2020, 1.2 million adults were victims. That is more people victimised than the total population of the South Island. In 2019, the government committed to taking a new direction in order to reform New Zealand's criminal justice system. And a significant part of that commitment was to decrease the number of people victimised and to provide better support for victims of crime. The increasing levels of victimisation in our community have been a constant theme we have highlighted in the State of the Nation report, and we continue to highlight that this year. Overall, in the past year, estimated offending in our communities has remained relatively unchanged. A closer look shows that there were increases in assaults, sexual assaults and theft, but these were offset by declines in almost every other offence. When we drill a bit deeper and look only at violent offending, these include offences such as manslaughter, murder, assaults and abduction. In the past year, these offences have increased by almost 10%. We are unsure whether this data reflects the realities our communities are facing or whether it is a shift in police focus. But what the data is clear on is that it shows us there is a shift in the type of crime in New Zealand towards more serious and more violent offending. 1 every 5 minutes. That's the phrase coined to show the extent of family violence in New Zealand, because police are called out to a family violence incident every 5 minutes. In the past year, police attended 168,436 family harm investigations, which equates to 1 every 3 minutes on average. To put that into context, if you combine the total population of Dunedin and Rotorua, you'll still be 5,000 short of the number of family harm investigations police attended. Combating New Zealand's family violence rate has been a continual point of contention for all successive governments. But it isn't all bad news. The number of convictions, prosecutions and imprisonments have been decreasing. The prison muster is now at its lowest since 2010. Maori imprisonment rates have also been decreasing. However, for Maori compared to non-Maori, they are 6 times more likely to be imprisoned. The recidivism rates continue to remain stubbornly high, particularly after 2 years of follow-up. Transforming the justice system to better support victims and break cycles of offending require approaches that are preventative, rehabilitative, restorative, and holds offenders to account. The contrasting trends we see in the crime and punishment chapter illustrate the justice system's attempt to find the balance in these approaches in order to create long-term changes for a safer New Zealand.
There are 4 areas that we monitor in the social hazard section of this report: alcohol use, the use of illegal drugs, gambling, and problem debt and financial hardship. All of these are regular activities for most people in New Zealand society. Most of these actions are legal and regulated by the government, but some of them are illegal. These 4 activities are also areas where the Salvation Army provides different social and Christian spiritual support services for people in whānau throughout the country. This year's results are, as usual, a mixed bag. There are many encouraging changes. This includes decreases in hazardous drinking behaviour for many of the groups that we monitor. There's also been a decrease in drug detection and wastewater, a decrease in most forms of gambling expenditure, and also a decrease in the number of pokie machines that are operating around the country. These are changes that we need to acknowledge and also celebrate. However, there's still some really challenging results in the social hazard section. For example, the availability of alcohol increased slightly in the last year, and hazardous drinking remains problematic for younger New Zealanders, Maori, Pasifika, and those living in communities with high levels of social deprivation. Also, methamphetamine-related offences continue to dominate illegal drug charges, convictions and detections in wastewater. It's still dominated in terms of a meth story. This has continued many of the trends in illegal drug charges, convictions and detection that we've noted over the last 5 to 10 years of this report. And also, nearly all forms of gambling declined in the last year, except for gambling through New Zealand lotteries, particularly gambling online. This increased massively in the last couple of years. The last 2 years of COVID, to be honest, has been really good for business for these online gambling sites. For example, digital sales for New Zealand lotteries were 201 million in 2018. By 2021, 3 years later, this increased to over 558 million. That's a 178% increase in the last 3 years in online digital sales for Lotteries New Zealand. And also, while the total number of pokie machines has declined across the country, the gaming machine profit, or the amount of money lost per machine, continues to climb. That means the machines that are remaining across the country are actually producing more losses for gamblers. And these machines continue to be found in areas of high social deprivation. In 2021, 33% of all pokie machines were in venues located in areas with high deprivation, areas that I grew up in, like, for example, in Mangere and South Auckland. In contrast, only 7% of pokie machines are operating in areas with very low levels of deprivation. Finally, financial hardship likely worsened for many New Zealanders, as shown by the increases in loans from non-bank lending institutions or second or third tier lenders, and also the increase in the number of people making withdrawals from their KiwiSaver fund for financial hardship reasons. Greater protections in policy and law are needed in all of these areas that we cover in this report. For example, we've consistently fought for an urgent review by the government of the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act to impact on alcohol consumption, hazardous drinking, and alcohol problems in local communities like this. Additionally, we've challenged the government for stronger online gambling laws to protect vulnerable gamblers and vulnerable New Zealanders across the country.
This report is presented by the Salvation Army. The theme of the State of the Nation report this year is about navigating the rapids in the hope of traversing change. It was a challenging year for everyone in 2021, but it was particularly tough for many Maori. The vaccine rollout across the country failed to respond well enough, causing unequal access for many Maori and limiting access to good health services. This highlights again the continuing inequities for Māori across the country. The way to change social and economic outcomes for Māori is to see what is happening through the lens of Te Ao Māori, the Māori worldview. He Ara Wai Order is a framework that helps do this by putting 4 aspects of wellbeing in focus that Māori view as essential to fulfilled lives. Mana ahinga, capacity, opportunity and function. Mana taututu, reciprocity. Mana whanake, growth and development. And mana tuku iho, utilising inherited knowledge. We adapt this lens to the social indicators. We can see more clearly where we are doing better at improving outcomes for Māori, and we can see whether we are getting closer to equity in the level of wellbeing experienced by Māori and non-Māori. In the report, we look at a whole range of indicators, but I'll just focus on just 2. 5 years ago, in 2016, 386 rangatahi aged 17 to 19 years were sent to prison. In 2021, the number had fallen to just 84. The number for Māori youth is still way too high. I know from my experience as a prison chaplain that prison is no place for teenagers. Police and the justice system have greatly changed the way they work with rangatahi who offend and how they are dealt with. Rangatahi courts are one example of using a kaupapa Māori approach that gives rangatahi a chance to find their place in Te Ao Māori while facing the consequences of their actions and finding ways to restore damaged relationships. Unfortunately, another area where we're not doing well is the crisis area of unaffordable housing. Māori are almost 5 times more likely to be in need of social housing, and this has got much worse in the past year. Although there are exciting and innovative Māori-led housing projects underway, there is continuing need for housing that is in the right place and of the right design to meet the needs of whānau. Let us learn from where we are doing better and apply these lessons to the things that need to improve. Nā reira, kia kaha Aotearoa, tēnā tātou.
Okay, so that's our presentation now, and of course it's now the opportunity for question time. And what I'm going to do is There's been a number of questions asked. I'm going to work down through the chat, and hopefully we've got enough time to answer all the questions. If not, we'll certainly encourage people to send us emails after this, but we're going to finish no later than 1 o'clock. So let's start with the questions in order. And the first question that came up is, it's not favoritism, it just so happens to be Lynette, who's my wife, and she's asked, there are lots of pop-up food banks. Does this potentially undermine the pressure to change policy settings to move to real food security? And I've asked if Paul Barber could provide a response to that question.
Yeah, look, thanks for that question. And I guess my response would be that whatever it takes really to ensure that people get access to food at this stage is really important. But what will make the structural change is that work to lift the incomes, improve the housing, improve the situation of people, and to work and to further develop those community shared initiatives that are being, have been underway in the past years. And it's been really exciting to see new approaches to community collaboration around distributing food and around, ensuring that food recovery and that the various networks work together. So, yeah, I guess that would be my initial response at this stage.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. So we've got 2 housing questions coming up now, and I'm asking if Ronji could perhaps respond to them. They are one from Sam Coates. He says, with the sheer size and scope of the housing crisis, what specific recommendations policy-wise can we make to try to solve this problem? It seems incredibly complex, so if it can be hard to know where to begin. That was one question. Second one is, what are some of the solutions to high rents? One was from Sam Coates, second one from Christine Domain. Ronji.
Hey, kia ora whānau. Hope you can hear me okay. Look, thanks for asking the questions. I'll try and give some thoughtful answers to it. I guess firstly, if I could just touch on the rental question. I think there's been a lot of discussion in the media lately around rent controls and people challenging that and debating whether they are actually useful or not. And look, some of that research is a little bit split, but rent controls are one of the measures that we can take to try and control the rise of rents. I think there's other measures that we can use, including indexing rents to incomes. There's also been a lot of changes recently to the Residential Tenancies Act that we really need to try and make sure they play out, so we can actually see the impact of these changes, and actually hopefully they have an impact. And so that's something that we need to add to the toolkit. There's probably another interesting, I wonder about the role of the community housing sector in terms of long-term rental accommodation, and I don't know if that is possible with the current status of CHIPS in New Zealand today, but I wonder if there's a role there. And I guess finally, another thing that we have recommended in the past is for those people in whānau that do want to transition from rental accommodation into home ownership and have that aspiration and the ability to transition, then we really need to strengthen some of those progressive home ownership schemes and those shared equity schemes to help that whānau get into the housing market. And it's tough, I understand that, but I guess when we're looking at some of the measures to try and control the rents, those are some of the toolkit that we've sort of looked at. I missed Sam's question. Sorry, Ian. It's not that I'm trying to miss Sam on purpose, but I did miss his question. So,
well, Sam asked the hard question. He said, with the sheer size and scope of the housing crisis, what specific recommendations, policy-wise, can we make to try to solve this problem? It seems incredibly complex, so it can be hard to know where to begin.
Hey, look, Sam, that's a really easy question that you've asked, and I think the reality is, Sam, that a lot of those measures that the Salvation Army has advocated for are in play at the moment. So there's a growing a role of the community housing provider section that's moving into the housing space.
There's an increase in building consent. That's something that many of us have been asking for. There's an increasing role for iwi and Maori organisations in the housing space. There's changes to legislation. So I think there's a lot of good, decent, hopeful changes that are already in play at the moment. In the end, what we really want to do is make sure that they do roll out and they play out and they have the impact that they're meant to have. I think what we've really tried to highlight in State of the Nation is, look, the rental stuff and the house prices are shocking. Those are crazy numbers. But what we want to really do is make sure that the focus is on those in the sharper end of the housing continuum, those who are on the register, those in transitional emergency housing, homeless, overcrowding, and so on. And so, while there's a lot of consents of houses being built, and there's a lot of action in that space, we really need to ensure that homes are being built for the sharper end of the continuum. And so there's enough transitional housing spaces that we're moving people out of emergency housing into TH or other long-term social housing. And essentially, we want to make sure that the spotlight is on that group of people that really do come through our doors, right? And making sure that their housing needs aren't lost in the whole housing crisis, housing catastrophe talk. So that's the basic answer I'd give. There's a lot of stuff happening at the moment, and we really support a lot of that stuff. But again, we've really pushed the role of the community housing sector, local groups, local iwi, because we really believe that that local groups can provide good local solutions to local problems.
Thanks, Ronji. So the next question I have is for Paul, and it's from Irene Farnham, and I'll read it out. In regards to education and parity rates, where Māori have typically lagged behind other ethnic groups in mainstream context, what does SPPU think about the place of Māori medium education, considering the fact that Māori student success in that context is often higher than the general success rates in mainstream education? Paul.
Yeah, kia ora, Anu. Thanks for that question. And this is a chance for me to introduce a little bit of the dashboard. So I'm going to try sharing my screen just to show you one of the slides from our dashboard. Now, can you see that? Can you see our dashboard on my screen? Ian, can you see it?
I can. Yes, I can.
Right.
Somebody's just asked, I don't know. Somebody asked to read the question again. Sorry, I'll try and, I'm not sure, somebody didn't hear the question. I'll just read it again. Oh, I'm sorry. The person was joking. Ignore that. My apologies.
Right, yeah. Basically looking at the question around Māori medium education in this chart from that's in the report as well, you can see the different categories of achievement for students leaving school and achieving NCEA level 1 or higher. And the yellow line here is the achievement of Māori students in Māori medium education. The grey line is all students achievement. And the purple line further down is Māori and English medium education, or sorry, the blue line. And what you can see is certainly that students in Māori medium education have very similar levels of achievement. The only downside is that in the year 2020, the most recent information we've got, we actually saw a bit of a decline where their education appears to have been more impacted by the COVID restrictions during 2020. But I would say, there's a relatively small number of around 600 or 700 students, I think, in Māori medium education. Most Māori are still learning in mainstream and English medium education. Yeah, I don't know, Amiria, if you want to make any other comment from your thinking around this, but there are definitely plans to increase Māori medium education to around 30% of all students, and I would say that would be looks like it would be a really good solution.
Kia ora, Paul. I will add to that. So 2020 saw a decline in Māori rangatahi achievement in education, with Maori leaving school with a minimum qualification of NCEA level 1. And COVID overall, we know, has had a significant impact on education, but just as significant on Māori rangatahi, harder hit by the effects of COVID and having to leave school earlier than expected, which may be a reflection on the socio-economic realities of whānau, for example, older siblings having to leave school early to take care of younger siblings or elders living in the home. So I just wanted to contribute that to the discussion, Paul. Thank you.
Okay, well, there's quite a few good questions, and since we've got Irene's name there, she's asked one about the recidivism rates remain high due to the absence of rehabilitation services which adequately support people when they are reintroduced to the community. Now I'm going to ask Ana if she can speak to that one. That comes out of her section. So Ana, can you respond to that question, please?
Hello everyone. Thanks for your question, Irene. Can you hear me? Cool. So in our report, as we've always highlighted in the State of the Nation report, is the funding that corrections puts towards rehabilitation and reintegration. I think the key to recidivism is reintegration, and what we've highlighted is that there needs to be more reintegration support for people coming out of prisons, but at the same time there needs to be long-term rehabilitation and reintegration, because when we follow up at 12 months, the recidivism rates are dropping, but when we follow up at 24 months, the recidivism rates go higher, and that's particularly for Māori. The disparity for Māori and non-Māori at 24-month follow-up is growing, and so yeah, corrections has put in corrections funding towards rehabilitation and reintegration has gone up by 64% in the past 5 years, but Salvation Army offers reintegration services, and so that's one thing that we really push for, is being able to reintegrate people back into the community, because that's one of the reasons why they would return to a life of crime, is because there's no alternative or there's no options provided for them to get their feet back on the ground. Yeah, so thanks for your question. I don't know if I answered that, but yeah, agree. We need to do more around reintegration and rehabilitation.
Okay, we had a question about interest rates from, hold on, who was that from? Sorry, I've just lost my place. I've asked Ronji to answer it. I just can't remember who the person was that asked it, but interest rates and housing. Ronji, can you answer that question? How's it going to impact?
Actually, I don't know the question. I know there are interest rates in housing, so that's what I know. I don't know the question, sorry, Ian.
I'll see if I can find it again. Sorry about that.
It's all good.
Donna Headley, the increasing home interest rates for first home buyers may paint a different picture for homeowners, and as a question mark. How do you see that, I guess, is what's it going to do for first home buyers?
I think one of the things that we alluded to in the report, or actually we said a little bit clearly, is that prospective first home buyers, a lot of them would be effectively locked out of the market because of just the soaring house prices. And so with the change in interest rates and the way the market is going, again, one of the things we've constantly talked about is trying to move people along the housing continuum, along that housing spectrum. And so if people are unable to transition out of private rent or staying with family into home ownership, then that does create bottlenecks on the other end as well. And so I guess the report is pointing to the fact that if we're not getting on top of these affordability questions and challenges, and we're not providing good, solid pathways for people into home ownership who do aspire and can afford to get into that pathway, then that just continues to lock people out of the market. Again, we did talk about that in our report, but we've consistently tried to focus on the sharper end of the continuum. So we acknowledge those real needs for the rest of New Zealand, but we did try to highlight more what was happening in that sharper end. So hopefully that's a helpful response.
Thanks, Ronji. That's really good. I've asked Paul the next question. Paul's question comes from Chris Limmer. Our staff in transitional housing say the rise in rent has far outpaced the rise in the benefit. Does the SPPU think the level of benefit payment is part of the problem? Paul, can you respond to that? Thanks.
Yeah, well, thanks again. That's a really good question, and I think that is one of the we're talking about in responding to the housing crisis, that you need a range of responses, and one of the responses that will can work in best in the short term is to address the level of housing support payments that are part of our welfare system. I mean, we talk about in the report about the fact that we're hearing somebody's mentioned in the chat a $700 a week rent for Porirua, and the median rent anyway at the moment is around $500. The maximum accommodation supplement in that area is $220 a week. So there's a huge disparity between what the welfare system can supply to help people stay in their accommodation, not lose their tenancy, as well as helping people to actually afford a new tenancy. So I would see that as part of the changes that need to happen that were recommended in the 2019 Welfare Expert Advisory Group. They included a number of recommendations of how to improve how the welfare system pays accommodation support, and not only reviewing the level of it, but also the area system for the accommodation supplement, and how thresholds for that it's reduced again, that it's abated after people increase earnings, and also just ensuring that the numbers do keep up with living costs. I think all those things need to be looked at.
Thanks, Paul. I'm just going to ask Ronji now. There's a question come from Ingrid about, do you have a gender breakdown for those on the register or in emergency housing? I'm not sure of the answer to that. Do you have anything to say to that, Paul? I mean, Ronji?
Thanks for the question. The basic response is that in the report we only covered the total number of those that were in the register, so we didn't do that breakdown, but we are able to access those numbers because it does break it down into composition of family, gender, and location in the country, and so on. So if you want more information for that, Ingrid, or I think it was Ingrid that asked, then please send through what you're after. But we do have access to that, but it's not in the State of the Nation.
While you're still there, Ronji, I'm sure you've got an answer for this one, hopefully. Lynette asked, can we get information about offshore gambling, as it seems this is a really big challenge? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we can. It's a little bit hazy and a little bit difficult to try and get some of the information, but I think we're in the blessed position to have Oasis and Lisa and Siobhan and the team working in that space to try and help us access some of that information. But I guess the focus of the State of the Nation was around this massive surge of gambling locally in terms of Lotteries New Zealand, and the fact that there's been a jump from $200 million to nearly $560 million spent on digital sales in the last 3 years. So we do know that offshore online gambling is a significant issue. And we raised it in one of our advocacy reports last year. But I guess we've tried to balance that by focusing on local online gambling through Lotteries New Zealand in this year's State of the Nation. But I think I might need to defer to Lisa and Siobhan and the team to get more of the right places to look for the offshore gambling numbers.
Thank you, Ronji. I've got a question for Paul. I'm not sure if he will have an answer for it, but it sort of fits within his area, perhaps. Erica Curse has asked, has there been any research for children with neurodiversity and learning difficulties, as this has been a significant experience in the education sector, which often impacts the ability for parents to work, for children to flourish in school and gain opportunities as young adults at times, leading to becoming part of the criminal system, adult mental health and addictions. Any thoughts on that one, Paul?
Well, look, I mean, the first answer, I don't have anything at the top of mind as far as research, but having said that, I'm aware that there's very much an issue, and for young people in the education system, and also their impact it has generally on their life outcomes. And I think probably reflects the fact that young children with disability among the groups that experience poverty and housing disadvantage, among the highest rates of children. So I guess then the short answer is, sorry, don't have anything, but would be really happy to follow up and see what we can, what's actually being done in that area. I think it's an important question.
Thanks, Paul. I've got a question from Ofa Jews for, well, it's been directly asked to Ronji, so I'll ask him and see if he can answer this one. Ronji, you were quoted today as saying, "We've all failed in addressing poverty for some of New Zealand's most disadvantaged families." Can you please elaborate on that and advise where we may immediately take action together and these families and out of our failure and into success? $1 million question there, Ronji. I'm sure you've got the answer.
Yeah, I've got a answer. I don't know if it's the answer, but I guess part of that was an interview this morning, and I think that the heart behind that offer was to try and paint the picture that when we're talking about well-being and the deprivation and the needs and the poverty that we're seeing, that I believe that there's an onus on us, particularly as a Christian organization, and seeing that the fact that we're all made in the image of God, that we should all play a part in contributing not just to the well-being of everyone, but especially to those that are suffering and the most vulnerable. And I think the fact that these issues aren't top of mind, that these issues aren't always in the news, that these issues aren't popular in terms of what's happening in society, then I think that's part of the fact that we have failed in, one, understanding, two, really appreciating, and I think three, trying to work out what ways we can contribute to this. I think it was a cheeky statement to hopefully challenge people to say, look, we can all, this is the fellow man, this is the fellow New Zealander, this is the neighbour that we often talk about here at the Salvation Army, and so we should be caring and understanding and working out ways to support all New Zealanders, but especially those who are the most vulnerable. So I think that's where I was really trying to get in terms of that quote and being a little bit of a smartass with that quote as well. But the other part of that is in terms of what do we do from that. I think that's the whole idea of what State of the Nation is we're there to try and inform and equip and help people understand with these numbers. And we all know this, whānau, behind all the numbers, real stories, real people, real life. So I know that we all get that. But if we don't have a real appreciation about what the numbers are telling us and what the real issues are, then we don't know how to act and we don't know where to act. I think part of that is trying to understand in our own sphere, in our own world, in our own circle of influence, where can we act when it comes to not just learning and understanding, but also working out how to respond to the issues that we've raised. And that's where I think we've all failed, but we can all play a part in those solutions. So hopefully that might answer some of those thoughts. Malo.
Okay, thank you, Ronji. Paul's going to ask essentially, I think we've only got time for this one question, so I'm not sure if he can answer it, but Paul, Phil White asked, does the SPPU look at any health indicators, e.g. levels of COVID infections across different ethnicities and dental health? I mean, basically, do we look at health indicators in general?
Yeah, I guess there's a short answer that those more specific health indicators you were talking about, we don't look at the areas of health that we cover are related to mental health and addiction. So that's the kind of space where the work that the Salvation Army intersects with the health system. And I guess, again, taking the liberty of showing off the dashboard again, I'll just share with you the screen here on the mental health from the New Zealand Health Survey that shows how children and young people are reporting higher. Basically, the chart shows those who are reporting low psychological distress, and you can see that the numbers dropping of those who are reporting low psychological distress this year. Interestingly, in 2020, that there was a bit of a pickup around the sort of lockdown time, but what we're seeing is a general trend towards more young people reporting moderate to high levels of psychological distress, like anxiety or depression. So I guess what I'm saying there is simply that there's we don't cover a lot of the information. I think Amiria, again, I'd probably hand across to you, just thinking about the impacts of the pandemic on Maori as we've
Okay. Oh, thank you, everyone. That's all the time that we have. As I said earlier, if there are other questions, please send them to us on our email address, and we'll look to try and answer them in a timely fashion. I've enjoyed, I'm sure the others of the team really appreciate this opportunity to engage with you all. And other than that, have a good day and God bless.